The letter arrived on a Wednesday, which was the same day her uncle burned her mother's correspondence in the parlor fireplace and told her she had misremembered what her father's will said. Louisa Fenmore had not misremembered. She had read the document herself, twice, in the solicitor's office on the morning of her father's funeral, while her uncle stood beside her, with his hand on her shoulder in the manner of a man performing grief for an audience. She had been 17 then. She was 22 now. She had spent 5 years learning the particular discipline of a woman who knew something she was not permitted to say. The letter was from Northmere. That was all it said on the outside, in a hand she did not recognize. Northmere, and below it, her name. Not her assumed name, not the name she had been using for 3 years in the Fenmore household as her uncle's ward, dependent, useful, invisible, her real name, Louisa Marguerite Fenmore, which no one had called her since her father died, and her uncle had decided. With the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, that certain arrangements needed to be revisited. She had not opened the letter in the parlor. She had taken it upstairs to the small room at the end of the east corridor, not a guest room, not quite a servant's room, the particular social purgatory of a woman whose position in a household has been deliberately left undefined. And she had sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her name on the outside of the envelope for a long time before she opened it. The letter was short. 3 sentences. Your father's estate at Northmere has been without its proper heir for 5 years. I have reason to believe this is not accidental. If you are willing to come as staff, come as yourself, and you will be turned away before you reach the gate. It was signed, W. Callender, steward of Northmere. She had read it 4 times. Then she had folded it, put it inside the cover of the book on her nightstand, and gone downstairs to help her uncle's wife prepare for Thursday supper, as though nothing had changed. It was a skill she had become very good at, performing ordinary in rooms where extraordinary things had already happened. She left on a Saturday, which was the day her uncle went to his club, and her aunt took the younger children to visit her sister in Gloucester. She took 1 bag. She left a note that said she had gone to visit a school friend and would return within the fortnight. It was not a lie exactly. She had a school friend in the direction she was traveling, and she would return within a fortnight, though not in any condition her uncle would find convenient. The journey to Northmere took most of the day. She changed coaches twice and spent the final hour on a cart driven by a man who said nothing, but nodded when she named the village, and moved over to make room. The countryside grew wilder as the afternoon went on, the hedgerows giving way to open moorland, to stone walls, to the particular gray-green of the north in late September, when everything is deciding whether to hold on or let go. She had been born at Northmere. She knew this the way she knew most things about her first years, imprecisely, through the accumulated evidence of small memories that could not be organized into a reliable sequence. The smell of cold stone and something floral, maybe lavender, the sound of her father's voice reading aloud in a room with high ceilings, a window that looked out over water. She had not been back since her mother died when she was 4, and her father had taken her south to London, where the estate matters were easier to manage, and where he had, as far as she could tell, spent the rest of his life quietly trying to forget something that the northern light kept reminding him of. She had not known until she read his will that Northmere had been hers. That it had been hers specifically, not as part of the general estate, but named, left to her directly, with provisions and guardianship arrangements that her uncle had apparently found it inconvenient to honor. The cart stopped at the edge of a village. The driver nodded toward a road that curved uphill between 2 stone walls. Northmere, he said, without elaboration. She thanked him and got down with her bag and walked. The estate appeared at the top of the rise the way things appear in the north. slowly and then completely, as though it had been there so long it no longer needed to announce itself. The main house was built from the same gray stone as the walls along the road, older than she had imagined, with a slate roof and windows that caught the late afternoon light and held it without giving much back. Formal gardens to the east, gone slightly to seed in the way of gardens that are maintained but not loved. A long gravel drive. She did not go up the drive. She had thought about this. The letter had said, "Come as staff." She went around to the side entrance, the one she found by following the path that servants used, identifiable by the worn earth and the kitchen smell. She knocked. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 60, with gray hair and the eyes of someone who had been making assessments all her life and had grown efficient at it. She looked at Louisa's bag, and then at her face, and then at her bag again. "Mrs. Westing, the housekeeper." She said it as though completing a form. "And you are." Louisa had prepared for this. She had a name ready, plain, unmemorable, the kind of name a young woman might have who was arriving to take a position as household assistant. She had a reference letter she had written herself, which she was not proud of, but which was, she felt, proportionate to the circumstances. "Lena Morse," she said. "Mr. Callender wrote." Mrs. Westing looked at her for one more moment, the extended look of a woman deciding whether to ask a question she already knew the answer to, and then stood back from the door. "You're late. Come in." She had expected to be placed below stairs. She had prepared herself for it, for the particular discipline of moving through a house where she had been born as someone who had no claim to it, of making herself useful and quiet and careful not to look too long at anything that might give her away. What she had not prepared for was the house itself. The interior was older than the exterior had suggested, the entrance hall flagged in stone, the walls paneled in dark wood, the particular smell of a place that had been burning peat fires since before anyone living could remember. She had been in dozens of houses in 5 years of dependent existence. She had not been in one that felt like this, like something she had misplaced and spent years walking past without knowing what she was looking for. She followed Mrs. Westing through the corridor and tried not to look too carefully at anything. She failed immediately at the portrait. It hung at the turn of the staircase, not prominently, not in a position of display. The kind of placement that suggested it had been there for decades and had simply stayed because moving it would have required a decision no one had gotten around to making. A woman, perhaps 30, painted in the style of 30 years ago, in a dress the color of autumn moss, with dark hair and the particular quality of expression that portrait painters sometimes achieved and more often didn't, the quality of a real person who had momentarily forgotten they were being painted. She had her mother's mouth. That was the first thing Louisa thought, and then, with a clarity that arrived before she could stop it, no, her mother had had hers. She realized she had stopped walking. Mrs. Westing had turned back and was looking at her with the specific patience of a woman who had seen new staff make this mistake before, stopping in corridors, getting turned around, taking longer than was strictly necessary to move from one place to another. "Portrait's been there since before I came," Mrs. Westing said. 31 years. You'll stop noticing it." Louisa looked at the brass plate on the bottom of the frame. Small, tarnished, but legible. S. Fenmore, Northmere, S. Fenmore. Her grandmother, she thought. Her father's mother, who had died before Louisa was born, and who she had never had a name for beyond grandmother, which was not a name so much as a category. She had a face now. She kept walking. She did not say anything. She was getting better, she thought, at that particular kind of silence. She was given a room in the upper staff quarters, small, clean, with a window that looked north toward the moor. She was given a list of duties by Mrs. Westing the following morning, practical things, the kind of work that kept a house functioning, and that a woman in her position would be expected to manage without complaint. She managed it without complaint. She also managed to learn, in the first 3 days, the general shape of the household and who was in it. The Duke of Northmere was in residence. This surprised her. She had assumed, from the letter, from the 5 years of silence, from the general state of the formal gardens, that the house was under some kind of caretaker arrangement, that whoever held the estate now held it at a distance. He did not hold it at a distance. He was here, apparently had been for some months, and moved through the house with the quiet purposefulness of a man who had come to do something specific and was doing it. She had not seen him yet on the 3rd day. She had seen evidence of him, papers in the library, boot prints, on the flagged hall floor, the small adjustments a house made to the presence of someone who was actually living in it, rather than passing through. On the 4th day, she saw him. She was in the library. She had gone in early, before the household woke, for the reason she told herself was professional, that she needed to dust the upper shelves, and for the real reason, which was that a room full of books in a house she was not supposed to know drew her in the way it always had, and she had not been in a proper library in 5 years. She was on the rolling ladder, reaching for the uppermost shelf, when the door opened. He was tall and not what she expected. She had expected someone who looked like an owner, which was a feeling she could not have defined precisely, but which had something to do with the ease of a man who had never been uncertain of his right to a room. He did not look like that. He looked like a man who had come in to find a specific book and was mildly surprised to find the ladder occupied. He said nothing immediately. She came down the ladder with as much composure as the ladder permitted, which was not complete composure because ladders do not cooperate with dignity in the way that ground-level situations do. "I didn't know anyone was in here," he said. It was not an accusation. "I was dusting," she said. "I'll come back." He looked at the shelf she had been reaching for. The books there were old, some of them obviously very old, the kind that had been on those shelves long enough to have earned their position through sheer duration. "What were you looking at?" She had been looking at a collection of letters, published, bound, from a correspondent she had recognized by name if not by the volume itself, a naturalist who had spent 30 years writing to a friend about the wildlife of the northern moors, whose work her father had read to her when she was small, badly, with great enthusiasm. "Nothing specific," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the particular way of a man deciding not to press a point he had noticed. Then he went to the shelves she had not been near, found what he was looking for without consulting anyone, and left. The door closed quietly. She stood in the library for a moment longer. Then she took the naturalist's letters down from the shelf herself and put them under her arm to read that evening, which was perhaps not what a household assistant was supposed to do, but which felt, in the particular logic of that moment, like something she was owed. She learned his name from Mrs. Westing the following day. The Duke of Northmere, formally. Gideon Ashmore in the household records, and the estate accounts that she had begun, quietly, to learn the shape of. Not because it was her business, because it had been her father's business, which was the same thing, which was the thing she could not say. She had been there 10 days when Mr. Callender found her. He came to the kitchen in the early morning, a thin man of perhaps 65, with the eyes of someone who had spent decades watching things from a careful distance and had learned what to do with what he saw. He said her name, her real name, the full one. She looked at him. He looked back. Then he tilted his head toward the door. They walked out to the kitchen garden, which was enclosed on 3 sides by stone walls and therefore private. "You came," he said. "You wrote," she said. "I didn't know if you'd received the letter. It had to go through your uncle's household. I received it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the kitchen garden with the expression of a man organizing something internally. "I have been steward here for 22 years, he said. "I knew your father, I knew him before he left, and I managed the correspondence with him after, for as long as he allowed it." He paused. She let him. "Your grandmother," he said, "commissioned the portrait on the stair landing. Did you see it?" "I saw it. Your father sat with her for it. She was 71 and in poor health, and she said she wanted a record of herself before she was gone. He painted her himself, badly, which he was the first to acknowledge, but she kept it because he had done it himself. He had the brass plate added after she died. S. Fenmore, Northmere. She did not have a title, she only had the name, and she considered that sufficient." Louisa looked at the wall. A bird was doing something purposeful in the far corner of the garden. She watched it, without seeing it. "What is the Duke's connection to this estate?" she said. "To my family. That," Mr. Callender said carefully, "is the question I have been trying to answer for 2 years, and I believe I am close. But I need someone who has standing to ask it." He looked at her, the kind of standing that requires the right name. She understood. "Not yet," she said, "not until I know what I'm asking about." He nodded, as though this was what he had expected. Then he said something else. "The Duke received correspondence from your uncle 6 months ago. I was not supposed to know about it. I knew about it because 31 years of managing this estate has given me a reasonably thorough understanding of what correspondence passes through it and how." He paused. "Your uncle told the Duke that your father had no surviving children." The kitchen garden was very still. She had heard this before. She had been told she didn't exist before, in various forms, and had survived all of them. But there was something about hearing it in this specific place, in the garden of the house her father had left her, standing 10 feet from where someone had apparently told its current occupant she was not real, that required a moment longer than usual to absorb. She absorbed it. Then, what did the Duke say? "Nothing that your uncle's solicitor expected," Mr. Callender said. "He asked for the documentation. All of it. He has been reviewing it since." She went back inside. She did her work, she thought. She had been thinking, carefully and without resolution for 5 years. What she had not been doing, for 5 years, was acting on what she thought. She had been waiting, in the way of someone who knows their moment has not arrived, and who has the particular discipline to recognize the difference between patience and passivity, and had chosen, consciously, the former. The moment, she thought, was possibly arriving. She was not sure yet what it looked like from the front. She found out on the 11th day, when the Duke came to the library again at the same early hour she had been there. And this time she was sitting in one of the chairs by the window reading the naturalist's letters, because she had simply stopped, pretending she was doing anything else. He looked at the book. He looked at her. She looked back and said nothing, because the situation did not seem to call for an explanation, and she had learned that silence, offered steadily, was often more informative than words. "You're reading Harland," he said. It was not quite an accusation, and not quite a question. "She is," she said. She set the book down on her knee in the manner of someone who has no intention of putting it away. He came into the room and sat down in the other chair, which was either because he was a man who went directly to the thing he intended to do, or because he did not feel like standing, and she had not yet determined which was more likely. "That book," he said, "has a name written in the front." She knew. She had found it on the first evening. The name was in a child's hand, the letters careful and slightly too large, the way letters are when someone is still negotiating the size they ought to be. She had recognized the handwriting, not with certainty, but with something close to it, as a version of her own writing from before she had grown old enough to develop a slant. "What name?" she said. He looked at her steadily. The look of a man who has decided before coming into the room that he is going to have a direct conversation and is now establishing whether the other party shares this intention. "L. Fenmore," he said. "Northmere. The library was quiet. Beyond the window, the moor was doing what the moor did in the mornings, existing in a gray and particular beauty that required nothing from you except to look. She thought about her choices. She could redirect. She could minimize. She could produce a reasonable explanation, a common name, a coincidence. The kinds of deflection she had been practicing for 5 years, with the focus of someone who understood that misdirection was not the same as lying, and that there were situations in which it was the only available instrument. She chose none of those things. "That's my name," she said. She said it simply, without drama, because there did not seem to be any point in drama at this stage. The silence lasted several seconds. "Your name," he said, "is Lena Morse. Lena Morse is the name I gave Mrs. Westing when I arrived. Why? Because Mr. Callender's letter told me to come as staff." She looked at him. "If I had come as myself, I would have been turned away before I reached the gate." He was very still in the way she had already begun to understand was how he processed things he did not yet know what to do with. Not cold, not defensive, simply still, in the manner of someone gathering information before they committed to a response. "Your uncle," he said after a moment, "told me your father had no surviving children." "I know," Mr. Callender told me. His expression shifted slightly. "Then, how long have you been here?" 11 days. "You've been here 11 days?" "Yes." Another silence, shorter this time. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the first morning in the library, but with something added, some adjustment made to the quality of the attention, like a man who had been looking at a landscape and has now understood that the interesting feature was not the horizon, but something much closer to where he was standing. "Louisa Fenmore," he said. He said it like he was reading something. She said, "Yes." "Your father's estate?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the specific way of a man who is choosing words, because he understands that some words, once said, change the shape of whatever comes after. "Then I have some things to show you," he said, "if you're willing." She said she was. He showed her the correspondence first. It was laid out on the desk in the study with the particular organization of a man who had been reviewing documents for months and had developed a system for them. Her uncle's letters were there, the ones that said she didn't exist. Beside them, in a separate stack, the replies from the Duke's solicitor asking for supporting documentation. Beside those, a series of documents she did not immediately recognize. "These came from your father's original solicitor," the Duke said. "The man your uncle replaced after your father's death. He found him in Edinburgh." He paused. "He has been very helpful." She looked at the documents. There were 2 versions of the will. She saw that before she read either of them. 2 documents of different lengths, one longer than the other, both bearing her father's name at the top. She looked at the shorter one first, the one she did not recognize, the one that made no mention of Northmere or of any arrangement regarding a daughter's inheritance. Then she looked at the longer one. She had been in the solicitor's office when this document was read. She had sat across from a man with very small handwriting and watched him turn pages, with the careful efficiency of someone who understood the weight of what they were holding. She recognized the language now, the formal constructions, the particular way her father's additions had been incorporated into the margins. His handwriting beside the solicitor's clean typed lines, making adjustments, adding emphasis, adding one paragraph in the final third that she had not forgotten in 5 years. "She is not to be managed." Her father had written in the margin, in his particular cramped hand that she had watched compose ledger entries and letters, and once, memorably, an extremely precise complaint to a neighbor about a fence that had migrated 3 feet onto Fenmore land. "She is not to be managed, held in reserve, or used as a convenience. She has her mother's intelligence and her grandmother's stubbornness and every capacity she needs. Give her Northmere and stand aside." She set the document down on the desk. The longer will, Gideon said, is the real one. The shorter one was submitted for probate. He looked at her carefully. Whoever submitted it had access to your father's signature and to the original document's general structure. What they did not have was your father's solicitor, who was in Edinburgh and not consulted, because your uncle's man told the court he had retired. He had not retired. He had simply not been asked. She thought about a Wednesday afternoon in her uncle's parlor and a fireplace full of her mother's correspondence. She thought about 5 years. There is a trust, the Duke said. Your father established it separately. Your uncle's solicitor would not have known it existed because your father was, according to the Edinburgh man, extremely deliberate about keeping certain arrangements private. He had the impression your uncle was a man who would find things if told where to look. Louisa looked at the moor through the study window. The light was changing, the particular shift of northern light in the late morning, moving from gray to something almost gold, and then back again, as though it couldn't quite commit. My father knew, she said. He knew this was possible. He thought it was possible, Gideon said. He prepared accordingly. She nodded slowly. Then, what is your connection to this estate? To my family. He was quiet. Not the quiet of evasion. The quiet of someone who has been sitting with a question long enough that the answer has settled into something he is now sure of. My mother, he said, grew up in this county. She knew your grandmother. Not well, not as close friends, but the way people in small counties know one another over decades. When she died, she left instructions that I found 2 years ago when I finally went through her papers properly. He paused. She had written to your father before her death. The letter was in her correspondence, unsent, which I think she meant to send and did not. He looked at the desk. She had concerns about what she had heard from the county about the arrangement your uncle was managing. She had written to your father's original solicitor in Edinburgh asking him to look into it. He found the second will 3 months later. You've known for 2 years. I've been building a case for 2 years, he said. There is a difference. He looked at her. I wrote to your uncle because I needed to understand what he would claim. What he claimed was that you didn't exist. He said it carefully. And she could hear underneath the careful something that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it. Anger that had been managed into something useful, which she was beginning to understand was how he handled most things. She thought about the ladder in the library, about the way he had come in looking for one specific book and found it without asking anyone, about the way he had come back this morning and sat down in the other chair without hesitation, as though he had decided before he arrived what kind of conversation this was going to be. She thought about her uncle's parlor on a Wednesday and the smell of burning paper. How do you want to proceed? She said. He looked at her. There it was again, that slight adjustment in the quality of attention, the recalibration of someone who had expected one thing and encountered something adjacent to it. That, he said, is entirely your decision. And what are my options? He laid them out. They were clear, well organized. The options of a man who had been thinking about this for 2 years and had arrived at a position of considerable preparedness. The Edinburgh solicitor was willing to proceed. The documentation was thorough. The false will carried the specific vulnerabilities of a document assembled in haste by someone who had not anticipated being examined closely. The trust was intact. Northmere was, by the original will, unambiguously hers. She could pursue it through the courts, which was slow and would require her to step out from cover, to become visible in exactly the way she had spent 5 years learning not to be. She could wait and continue building the case in the background, which she had effectively been doing for 5 years without knowing it was happening. Or she could proceed the way Gideon had been proceeding, quickly and quietly, through the specific channels that a man of his position had access to, and a woman of her current circumstances did not. I need a few days, she said, to to think. "Of course," he said. And then, with the directness she was beginning to anticipate, "Stay in the library if you like. The Harland letters are better than they look." She looked at him. "I read them when I was 20, he said. "My mother had the same edition." She went back to the library. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the moor and thought for a long time about what it meant to have a name and be told it didn't exist, and to walk into a house that was yours and knock on the servant's entrance. She thought about patience, and about the difference between patience and fear, and about which one had been driving her for the last 5 years, and about whether the difference mattered now that she was here. She thought about a portrait on a staircase landing, a woman with her own mouth, kept there for 31 years by a housekeeper, who had said she would stop noticing it. She had not stopped noticing it. She thought about her father writing in the margins of his own will, "Give her Northmere and stand aside." She put the Harland letters down. She went to find Mr. Callender. He was in the East Wing, reviewing inventory with the patience of a man who had been reviewing inventory at Northmere for 31 years, and had developed a system that required very little of him beyond showing up. He looked up when she came in. "I need to see the room," she said. "Whatever my father left here, whatever was kept." He set down his ledger. He had a key on his ring, the kind of key that was old enough to have been worn smooth at the teeth. He had been carrying it, she realized, for some time. Possibly he had been carrying it since he wrote her the letter, or before. He led her upstairs, past the portrait, along a corridor she had not yet been in, to a door at the end that was locked and unlocked now with the old key that he pressed briefly in his palm before he handed it to her. She went in alone. The room smelled of cedar and thyme, not unlived in, not abandoned, something more considered than that. The curtains were drawn, heavy ones, and she opened them, and the northern light came in flat and honest and showed her what was there. Her father's things. His desk, the portable writing slope he had used when traveling, the inkstand she remembered sitting beside when she was very small, the leather-bound diary collection organized by year in a row on the shelf, 24 of them going back before she was born. Her mother's things beside them. A small painting, a watercolor, of the moor in summer that her mother had done herself, badly but with obvious joy, the kind of art made by someone who loved the subject more than the technique. A sewing box, a pair of gloves worn through at the fingertips, and on the desk in an envelope addressed in a hand she knew, "Louisa, when you come," not if, when. Her father had known. He had not known the shape of what would happen, but he had known enough to prepare for the possibility that she would arrive here without announcement, and he had left her something for exactly that moment. She sat at the desk. She opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages. She read it twice, slowly, until the things that had been tight in her chest since she was 17 began to loosen in the particular way of things that have been held too long in too small a space. Her father had known about her uncle, had known the shape of him for years, and had tried to arrange things well enough that the shape of him wouldn't matter. He had not succeeded entirely, he wrote, but he had tried to leave her what she needed, which was not the same as leaving her safe. He had known that safety was not something he could give her. What he could give her was Northmere, the trust, the Edinburgh solicitor, and the portrait on the staircase landing. "Your grandmother," he wrote, "would have found a way back in through the kitchen door and had the whole thing sorted before anyone knew her name. She was the most stubborn person I ever loved. I hope you have inherited that from her along with her jaw, which I see every morning in your face and which has always been the family's best feature." She put the letter down. She looked at the watercolor of the moor. She looked at the diary row, 24 years of her father's daily life, organized and waiting. She picked up the key from where she had put it on the desk. She put it in her pocket. The next morning she went downstairs to breakfast, which she had been taking in the kitchen with the other staff. Mrs. Westing looked up when she came in and then looked more carefully, in the way of a woman whose primary professional skill was accurate assessment, and said nothing. Louisa ate her breakfast and then went to find the Duke. He was in the study. He looked up from his papers. "I've decided," she said. He set the papers down. "I want to proceed quickly," she said. "I want to write to the Edinburgh solicitor myself. I want to be present for every conversation, every review of documentation, everything. I am not interested in arrangements made on my behalf by people I am not in the room for. I have had 5 years of those arrangements, and they have been uniformly poor." He looked at her with an expression she was developing the capacity to read. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. Something closer to the recognition of a thing he had expected, and is now confirmed. "Then you'll need to stop being Lena Morse," he said. "I stopped being Lena Morse 3 days ago," she said. "I was just letting the situation catch up." The corner of his mouth moved very slightly, which she had already learned was the equivalent, for Gideon Ashmore, of laughing outright. She wrote to the Edinburgh solicitor that afternoon, at the desk in the library, in her own name, in her own handwriting. It was the first document she had signed with her real name in 5 years, and she felt the weight of it differently than she had expected. Not like relief exactly. More like the moment when you set down something you have been carrying so long. You had stopped noticing the weight and your arms feel strange in its absence. The solicitor arrived the following week. He was a small man with very careful hands and the demeanor of someone who had been doing righteous work in difficult circumstances for a long time, and had developed a particular quiet satisfaction in it. He shook her hand and said he had known her father and that he was very glad to see her, and the way he said it suggested he meant it in a way that was not merely professional. They sat in the study, the 3 of them, and the solicitor laid out the documentation in the order of its significance, and Gideon sat at the head of the table with the stillness of a man who had arranged this meeting and was now prepared to let it proceed without him managing it, which she had come to understand was one of the things he was best at. Creating the conditions for something and then stepping back. The false will had vulnerabilities the solicitor enumerated with the precision of a man who had been examining them for 2 years. The signatures were not contemporary with the document date. The witnesses named were not reachable because they did not exist, which was the kind of oversight that emerged when someone assembled a fraudulent document under time pressure without anticipating that anyone would look. The trust was intact and had been growing quietly for 5 years and 3 months. When the solicitor named the figure, Louisa looked at the window. Gideon said nothing, in the specific way of a man who had already known the figure and had decided not to mention it before she heard it from the right person. "Northmere is yours," the solicitor said, without qualification and without encumbrance. He paused. "Your father was very clear." She nodded. "Then, my uncle," the solicitor's expression adjusted. "Your uncle submitted a falsified document to probate. The consequences for that are, in my experience, substantial and lasting." He folded his hands on the table. "I have been waiting a long time to describe those consequences to someone with the standing to receive them." She thought about a Wednesday in a fireplace. She thought about 5 years of performing ordinary in rooms where extraordinary things had already happened. "Begin," she said. It did not happen quickly. These things never did. But it happened, with the particular efficiency of a case assembled over 2 years by a careful man with a quiet manner and the specific authority to use it. And what it produced, in the end, was not a scene, not a confrontation, not the kind of dramatic reckoning she had sometimes imagined in the small room at the end of the east corridor in her uncle's house. It produced paperwork, The right kind of paperwork, filed by the right people, in the right offices, which was both less satisfying and more permanent than anything else could have been. Her uncle had left the county by December. She did not know where he had gone and had not asked. She opened the formal gardens in March. Not to the public, not as an event. She simply had the gates unlocked that had been kept shut for the years since her father had left, and the groundskeeper, a man called Ferris, who had been at Northmere since before she was born, and who had greeted her. On the day she stopped being Lena Morse, with the expression of someone setting down a weight he had been carrying for a very long time, began to restore them to what they had apparently been, which was not formal at all, but various and slightly wild, the kind of gardens that had been designed to look as though they had always been exactly as they were. She walked in them in the mornings. Gideon joined her sometimes. He was still at Northmere. She had not asked him to stay, and he had not offered an explanation for it. He had business in the South that he attended to periodically, returning with the quiet lack of drama of a man who had somewhere specific to come back to and did not need to make an announcement about it. She had stopped being surprised by his presence and had started being, without exactly examining when the transition had occurred, glad of it. They had their arguments in the library, which was where most things between them happened, about the East Wing repairs and the groundskeeper's plans for the orchard, and the question of whether the oak at the north edge of the garden was diseased at the root or simply old. She said old. He said she was not a botanist. She said she didn't need to be. She read all her father's diaries by April. It took longer than she expected, not because there were many, though there were, but because she needed to read them in the way. She needed to read her mother's watercolor, with the understanding that she was seeing someone she had not been given enough time to know, and that knowing them, now, through the evidence they had left, was not less real than knowing them in person, only different. And a different thing was not a lesser thing. This was something she was still learning. She had a letter from the Edinburgh solicitor in May, the final one, the one that resolved the last of the outstanding matters. She read it at the desk in the room that had been locked and was now open, beside her father's writing slope and the inkstand she had sat beside when she was very small. She folded it carefully when she was finished. She put it in the desk drawer. She went downstairs. Gideon was in the library, which was where he could most reliably be found in the early evening, in the chair on the right side of the fireplace, with a book and a focused disregard for the hour. He looked up when she came in. "It's done," she said. He closed the book. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that had been developing over months from the careful assessment of the early days into something warmer, less guarded, something that had arrived gradually and completely without anyone declaring it. "Sit down," he said. "There's something I want to ask you." She sat. The fire was doing what fires do in old rooms, in old houses, making everything feel, despite everything, manageable, like something that had a center of warmth if you knew where to find it. She had found it. He did not ask the question directly. That was not, she had learned, how he asked things. He went sideways at them, circling, which was not evasion but care, the particular care of a man who understood that some questions changed things regardless of the answer and deserved to be approached accordingly. He talked about the garden first, and about the oak, which a man from the village had assessed as healthy, and which she received with the specific composure of someone who is not going to say, "I told you so," but whose face is saying it without her permission. He talked about his mother's unsent letter and about why he thought she hadn't sent it, which was not because she was uncertain, but because she had been ill by then, and things she had intended to do had been running out of time. He kept everything well, Louisa said. Whatever she intended, the people she trusted kept it. "Yes," he said, "they did." He looked at the fire, "and so did you. 5 years, on your own. I wasn't entirely on my own. You were mostly on your own. She thought about this honestly. Mostly, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. She had learned to read his silences, the difference between the silence of thinking and the silence of something else. This one was something else. I would like to propose, he said carefully, a different arrangement, one that would not require you to be mostly on your own. He paused. Not because you need assistance. He looked at her. Because I would prefer not to go back to a house that doesn't have your argument about the oak in it. She looked at him. That is the least romantic proposal I have ever heard described, she said. I haven't proposed anything yet. You're about to. He looked at her steadily, the quality of the attention she had learned to read. Not the early assessment, but the version that had developed since, the version that said he had already reached his conclusion and was simply waiting for her. I know what this house is to you, he said. I know it is yours and has always been yours, and I am not asking you to share it as a condition of anything. I am asking because I have spent 8 months watching you open it, and I would like to keep watching. He stopped. I would like to be the reason you have an argument to come home to. She looked at the fire. She thought about an envelope on a desk addressed in her father's hand. Louisa, when you come. Not if. She thought about a staircase portrait and a woman with her mother's mouth. She thought about a letter that had said, give her Northmere and stand aside, written by a man who had known her well enough to know that standing aside was the only way to give her anything worth having. She thought about a kitchen door and a name she had given a housekeeper and the particular discipline of 5 years of patience that had brought her to a room full of her father's diaries, unlocked, open, waiting. Yes, she said. She said it simply, because simplicity was the only register she trusted for things that were true. Yes, Gideon. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He reached across the table between them, and she gave him her hand, and they sat in the library of Northmere for a long time after that, in the comfortable and serious quiet of 2 people who have arrived somewhere together and are in no hurry to leave. The portrait stayed on the staircase landing. Mrs. Westing had been right, that you stopped noticing it in the way of noticing something new. But she had been wrong that you stopped noticing it altogether. Louisa walked past it every day, and every day she looked, not long, not in the way of the first morning, but in the way that you look at something that is yours and has always been yours, and that you are no longer in any danger of losing. S. Fenmore, Northmere, her grandmother, painted badly by a son who had loved her, kept for 31 years in the place she had always belonged. The diaries were moved to the library eventually, the whole 24-year row of them, to the shelf where the naturalist letters had been, where they fit as though the space had been waiting for them. The room that had been locked was unlocked permanently. The key stayed in Louisa's desk drawer, the one in her father's writing slope, in the room that smelled of cedar and thyme, and was now simply hers, which was not a simple thing at all, but was true, which was in the end the only standard she held anything to.